So, Sellars describes a perspicuous language, Jumblese. It's the language the Jumblies speak. They're the characters in Edward Lear's poem of that name. Sellars says he picked it because of the chorus that says, "Far and few, few and far are the land where the Jumblies live." So he's not claiming there actually are. They're these imaginary people. I actually think that various other things about this poem matter to him. He says, far and few are the lands where the Jumblies live. Their heads are green and their hands are blue, and they went to sea in a sieve. But in the last stanza of this, we get a comprehensive list of everything they took with them when they went to sea in a sieve. They brought an owl and a useful cart, and a pound of rice and a cranberry tart, and a hive of silvery bees. They brought a pig and some green jackdaws, and a lovely monkey with lollipop paws, and 40 bottles of rainbow ree, and no end of Stilton cheese. What they didn't bring was greenness or blueness, even though their heads were green and their hands were blue. And I have to think that Sellars was thinking about that as well, because we're told that that list before it was everything that they took with them in the boat. At any rate, you're invited to look at this short nonsense poem and see, what else he might have wanted. Now, the thing about Jumblese is it only has singular terms in it. All the expressions in it are names. Of course, you have to be able to say things in it, and you say things by producing an inscription of a name that has certain properties, or that certain facts are true of. So, for instance, we could say, Jumblese is, to begin with, think of a written language. We could say that Gustav Bergmann is Austrian by writing Gustav in Fraktur. And the fact that the word Gustav is written in that font says that Gustav is Austrian. If we want to write that Romeo loves Juliet, we won't have an expression for loves, but there'll be some fact about the relations between the inscription Romeo and the inscription Juliet. For instance, we might write Romeo above Juliet. And the fact that the inscription of Romeo is above the inscription of Juliet on the page means that Romeo loves Juliet. What we're supposed to see from this is that predication is a derivative speech act, parasitic on the fundamental things you can do, which are referring to some particular and saying something about it. The naming and saying of his title. One of the things that's bad about that is it really is referring, not naming. Naming really means baptizing, introducing something as a name. But it's really referring and claiming or saying something. Anyway, whenever he talks about the speech act of naming, he doesn't mean baptizing, he means using something as a name. That is referring. And he thinks the way this is going to be perspicuous is that we're not going to have these onomatoids that are predicate expressions such that we can ask what relation do they stand in, or do they express about the relations between them and the other expressions. Now here, the passage at the top of page 3, passage 14. To keep matters straight, it would be useful to introduce the term nexus in such a way that to say of something that it is a nexus is to say that it's perspicuously represented in discourse by a configuration of expressions rather than by a separate expression. And in Jumbelese, predicates are nexus. Instead of having an expression marking the predicative function, one has a nexus, an arrangement of the singular terms. Jumbelese is designed to make syntactically vivid the pragmatically dispensable character of predicate expressions. So if we express that Gustav is Austrian by writing Gustav in a distinctive font, we might say that Jumbelese overtly marks only the referring and the saying. It marks the referring by which singular term you used. We're talking about Gustav, not about Wilfrid, because we wrote the name Gustav, and we were saying he was Austrian rather than Canadian because we wrote it in Fraktur rather than in Times New Roman. We marked what one was asserting by the style in which we wrote the referring expression. It's the fact that Gustav is written in Fraktur, that fact that says that Gustav is Austrian. And as a consequence, there isn't any predicative expression like is Austrian that we could nominalize into Austrianness, the property of being Austrian. There's no expression there to nominalize. All there is a fact. There isn't any expression even that you could dot quote. Is Austrian, dot quote. Even though that would be okay, you wouldn't be abstracting in that case. But you can't even nominalize it in the good way, because you can't use the illustrating sign design principle on a mode of arrangement of objects or a monadic property of objects. Now, Sellars plays around with the jumblies. He considers what you'd have to do to have variables in jumblies, and not just term constants. And I mean, the details of that don't matter. He considers jumblies meta-languages. Inter alia, jumblies meta-languages for jumblies, where, for instance, we would say that writing something in Fraktur was predicating something of the term referred to there by writing the name of the font, Fraktur, in some other font, or putting Fraktur next to the word Fraktur, next to some other expression. He even amuses himself with considering what a translation of Bradley's appearance in reality into jumblies would look like. Since jumblies is designed to make it impossible to make the regress argument. I mean, it's a criterion of adequacy of it that you couldn't translate appearance in reality into jumblies. He doesn't say anything about the spoken versions of jumblies, even though our gospel on the jumblies reliably tells us that they said, "How wise we are, though the sky be dark and the voyage be long." And presumably they were speaking jumblies when they said that. But we can imagine spoken jumblies being a tonal language where you just utter strings of names, but rising and falling intonations of them express relations among them. Certainly both my mother when I was young and my wife now have ways of saying my name that are assertions that are not just referring to me, but saying something about me. So it seems to be spoken jumblies is not an impossibility. It might be that it would best be spoken by the whole choir that does a sort of Gregorian chant. That's the way I picture spoken jumblies. That's best spoken by the choir that's doing the chant. And the written version of that spoken jumblies would have to include a kind of musical notation, which actually is a kind of jumblies. It just write the names of notes, and it's by the arrangement of those names of notes that you convey information about them. Hermann Hesse's book, Glasperlenspiel, the Glass Bead Game, is really about a kind of Jumblese meta-language, or a written language for a written Jumblese language, corresponding to a musical spoken Jumblese language. Now, as I said, this technical invention of Sellars is one of the things he's best known for. But people have taken this idea a bridge too far. One of them who does, I think, is Tony Koch, who's a philosophy professor in Tübingen, who is interested in autonomous Jumblese. Not autonomous, this is A-U-T-O-N-Y-M-O-U-S. Something's autonomous if it's a name of itself. And it says, well now, let's think about 3- and even 4-dimensional Jumblese, in which to say that the thermos is next to the cup, we treat the cup as a name of itself and the thermos as a name of itself, and say that by putting the thermos next to the cup, that fact is expressing in autonomous Jumblese the fact that the thermos is next to the cup. And if we think about the incredible expressive power of autonomous Jumblese, we realize that it's a language in which you can say everything. Properly spoken, you can't make false claims in it. And it's the very form of the world's self-consciousness. Because everything that's true of it, it not only can say, but it does. Now, actually, autonomous Jumblese is not a language. There's no rules in it, and I hope your ears pricked up when I said you can't say false things in it. Well, then you can't say anything in it. You have to have rules that can be broken in order to have a language, even in Jumblese. Koch, this is the center of his metaphysics, is this picture of Jumblese in the world. He just has cycled out of bounds here. But you can read his papers and his books about this. Okay. Is it clear how the Jumblese works? He says what he's doing is just filling in what Wittgenstein is saying in this pi passage 3.1432. We must not say the complex sign ARB says A stands in relation to ARB, in relation R to B. That is, the complex sign, the complex object that is the A next to the R next to the B. We should say that A stands in a certain relation to B, says that ARB. So that A stands in a certain relation to B, that's a statement of a fact. It's not the complex object that says that things are thus and so. It's that fact about the names. And the fact about the names can be that there's an R between them. That's a perfectly good fact about them. But it's unperspicuous. It leads you to think that the R is playing a different kind of role in the language than it's playing. The fundamental roles in the language are naming and saying. Naming by writing down a certain singular term, and saying by doing that in a certain style or making some fact true of it, maybe in relation to, establishing a relation to other things. So if we want a perspicuous language, one that shows us the way in which predicating is derivative and parasitic, that you predicate by saying something using a referring expression, by making a fact true of a referring expression. And while you need the referring expressions and you need the facts about them, you don't need those facts about them to be marked by the use of further expressions. That's an optional way of getting facts true of these things. And so in the perspicuous language, you don't use expressions like that, you use other kinds of facts. And then it's perspicuous in his sense that there's no way to get the Bradley regress started. All there is the relation between A and B of being sort of to the left of here. And there isn't room for us to ask about, well, what is exemplification as the relation between the relation and the relata here. Now he contrasts this with Bergman's way of doing things. So here on the first page you see the very first passage, this essay adopts the Tractarian view that configurations of objects are expressed by configurations of names. Facts about objects that they are configured thus and so are expressed by the fact that, so this isn't maybe this introductory statement is maybe not ideal. Two alternatives are considered. The objects in atomic facts are one, without exception, particulars. That's his view. That's the Kotarbinsky reistic view. Or two, one or more particulars plus a universal. That's Bergman's view. On the first, a mode of configuration is always an empirical relation. On, for instance, loving. On two, it's the logical nexus of exemplification. It's argued that one is both Wittgenstein's view in the Tractatus and correct. And it's also argued that exemplification is a quasi-semantical relation and that it and universals are in the world only in the broad sense in which the world includes linguistic norms and roles, viewed, translating from the standpoint of a fellow participant. And then passages 3 through 7 are this Pi passage and his reading of Wittgenstein here. The crucial question Wittgenstein is making, point that Wittgenstein is making emerges when we ask, what are the parts of the statement in question, the relation of which to one another is essential to its character as a statement? And he's saying that's only the names. What Wittgenstein tells us is that while superficially regarded, the statement is a concatenation of three parts, A and R and B, viewed more profoundly, it's a two-term fact, with R coming into the statement as bringing it about that the expressions A and B are dyadically related in a certain way, i.e., bringing it about that the expressions A and B are related by having an R between them. Indeed, he's telling us that it's philosophically clarifying to recognize that instead of expressing the proposition that A is next to B by writing is next to between A and B, we could write A in some relation to B using only those signs. And in a perspicuous language, that's what we do. And then he introduces jumblese. Okay, so I read the beginning of this nexus passage over on the top of 3. To say of something that it's a nexus is to say that it's perspicuously represented in discourse by a configuration of expressions rather than a separate expression. That is, it's perspicuously represented by some fact about the expression rather than by another expression. That's what a nexus is. If we do this, we can contrast Bergman and Wittgenstein as follows. Wittgenstein, there are many nexus in the world. Simple relations of matters of fact are nexus. All objects and individuals which form a nexus are particulars, i.e. individuals of type 0, the lowest, the concreta. There is no relation or nexus of exemplification in the world. We can talk about exemplification, but that's metalinguistic talk. Not saying something about the world, but something about the talk. Bergman, there is only one nexus, exemplification. Every atomic state of affairs contains at least one individual which is not a particular, but a universal, a property or a relation. And now here's another definition. If one uses the term ineffable, if one so uses the term ineffable that to F something is to signify it by using a name, then Wittgenstein's view would be that what are ordinarily called relations are ineffable, for they're all nexus and are expressed by configurations of names. If the configuration of names involves further expressions, that's unperspicuous nexus, and if you don't use those, that's perspicuous nexus. For Bergman, on the other hand, what are ordinarily called relations are effed. It's exemplification which is ineffable. The relation between the relation or the universal and the particular, that's what is expressed by a configuration for Bergman. Okay. Now, he goes through the whole middle section of this essay about a very delicate point of Wittgenstein, of Tractatus interpretation, which is whether Wittgenstein can make sense of monadic facts. Because in the Tractatus, a fact is expressed by a relation between names. And you don't have a relation if you just got one name. And he doesn't have sort of modes of writing the name in the Tractatus. All the facts are relations of names. So, something having a monadic property can't be an elementary fact in the Tractatus. Well, this seems rather constraining, and Wittgenstein, in fact, says things on both sides. This is interesting about the Tractatus, but it's not an issue for jumblese or perspicuous language. Sellars, with the distance that he has from the Tractatus, can solve this problem just by allowing different styles of writing. So I don't propose to talk about that. What he said, I mean, I put the passages, some representative passages of that in here, and I'll just say his conclusion, this is passage 20. There's two attitudes Wittgenstein could have taken to monadic atomic facts. This on page 4. Thus, perhaps the correct answer to the historical question is that Wittgenstein would have regarded the question, are there bare particulars? He's talking about an Irving Copy article that claimed that the only view Wittgenstein could have is that the objects were bare particulars in the sense that they didn't have monadic properties, that is, didn't have any properties. They just stand in relations. That Wittgenstein would have regarded the question, are particulars bare, as in a deep sense a factual question, a question to which he did not claim to have the answer, and which as a logician he was not required to have the answer. He might have said that. So he's saying, maybe he thought particulars were bare, stood in relations but didn't have properties. But maybe he thought he didn't have to take a stand. The second remark is that Wittgenstein may well have thought that there are monadic atomic facts, indeed that their existence is obvious, but that no statement in ordinary usage represents such a fact, so that no example could be given in the sense of written down. Well, Sellars gives, I think, a very sensitive reading of Wittgenstein here, but it's to one side for the main points that he's making. I think he would have done better just to leave it out. I can't resist mentioning, because I take it that Irving Copy is probably not a character in your world, everybody in the generation of my teachers knew him because he was the first philosopher who ever became rich by writing a book, which was the textbook in first order logic. And nobody else had written them, and everybody bought it, and he actually retired to Hawaii with the money he'd made in his, it was in two pieces, the Introduction to Logic and the Introduction to Symbolic Logic. And then sort of after 15 years, everybody started writing them. He didn't have them. But he was famously at a meeting, I mean, he was actually a logician too, though not a particularly distinguished one. And he had presented one of his results at a logic meeting, and somebody stood up in the audience and said, do you realize that this result that you're proving was proven way back in the 40s by the Polish logician Kapilowicz? And Copy drew himself up and said, was I aware of this? Was I aware of this? I am Kapilowicz. He shortened his name when he became expatriate. And he was one of these Polish logicians. He was a minor one. I didn't put his name on it, but Copy was short for Kapilowicz. Yes, he was aware of this earlier version.
Mark told me that there was this guy who wrote this textbook and then moved to Hawaii. He didn't say who he was, but he said that it turned out that like his thing was inconsistent, his system in the book was inconsistent or incomplete or whatever, and he didn't care. He just went and it was just Hawaii.
This is true. It was easy to learn. Yeah, so I mean, he was a character sort of two philosophical generations ago. And he did have a position at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but basically he retired there, when he was quite young, on the basis of this. Okay. Sellars' argument against the Bergman position. So first of all, so I said he's thinking a perspicuous language is one in which you can't raise the Bradleyan regress. And that's true of the Bergman perspicuous language as well as the Jumbelese perspicuous language. Why? Because it has a nexus. It has the relation between universals and particulars represented not by some kind of expression, the word exemplification, but by a fact about the designation of the particular and the designation of the universal. And that's enough to keep the Bradleyan, to stop the Bradleyan regress. Now, as I say, we can see that there could be ultra-Bergmanian languages in which you did allow exemplification, but the next thing higher, the relation between exemplification and relations, was a nexus in the language. But you don't gain anything there. The question is whether there's anything more than names needed, or really in the world. Sellars' argument against Bergman is, for Bergman, everything turns on the claim that what's expressed by that nexus, what we can call exemplification, but it's important that that's not in the language that Bergman is putting forward as perspicuous. That the notion that the sentence, the yield sign exemplifies triangularity, is semantically equivalent to the yield sign is triangular. You can go back and forth, those are equivalent sentences. That's what his view turns on. But that overlooks a pragmatic asymmetry. If you already can use singular terms and predicates, then you can introduce expressions for universals. But pragmatically, you can't go the other way. Pragmatically, you've got to have singular terms, and to have them, you have to be able to predicate things of them. You have to be able to say something with them. That's pragmatically primary. And pragmatically, introducing these expressions that are nominalizations of those predicates is parasitic on that practice, though he doesn't say so, in the way in which using Luke's talk is parasitic on using his talk. And so he's going to argue that this pragmatic asymmetry is fundamental, and that Bergman has made a mistake because he only looked at the semantic equivalence of these and thought, well, you can tell the one story or you can tell the other. So Sellars is in many ways appreciative of the Bergman story. He's saying you do have a perspicuous language, perspicuous in that it blocks the Bradley regress, but it's still mistaken. The really perspicuous language would be Jumbelese, would be the one that only has singular terms as explicit expressions. Another historical footnote, Gustav Bergman was, along with my teacher Peter Hempel, the youngest member of the Vienna Circle, fled when early on, was the first person that Feigl hired at Iowa, and when Feigl moved from there, and then Feigl hired Sellars, and when Feigl and then later Sellars moved to Minnesota, Bergman stayed in Iowa and spent his career there as a metaphysician doing this stuff. So he was in this small circle of ex-Vienna Circle people with Sellers's other half during this period with Feigl. So it was absolutely natural for him to take as an interlocutor Bergman, who was a pretty minor philosophical figure by 1962 when he's writing this. But he was in that Carnap circle, and that was what Sellars identified with. Okay. Sellars ends up endorsing this Jumbelese in so far such tractarian perspicuous language, and draws not only semantic conclusions from it, that because pragmatically the two fundamental things you can do with language are refer and claim, naming and saying. We can see semantically that the other parts of speech, in particular property expressions or relational expressions, are derivative. They're semantically derivative because they're pragmatically derivative. They mark these parasitic speech acts. And he draws ontological conclusions. He wants to say, so, what's in the world, in the narrow sense, is what's referred to by genuine names. Names that are not onomatoids. And among the onomatoids are all the nominalizations of any other part of speech, and bad nominalizations of nouns, of common nouns. And his story there, I think, is because a proper understanding of what you're doing when you use those bad nominalizations, those onomatoids, is a metalinguistic story, which he's going to explain in terms of the dot triangular. And whatever can be given a metalinguistic explanation should be. You're not talking about the world when you use terms like triangularity, and so when you use terms like property, you're talking about the language, you're talking about talking. And among those onomatoids, those not genuine singular terms that masquerade as singular terms, is the common, are common nouns, fact and proposition, and the things that fall under them. The fact that snow is white, the proposition or claimable that snow is white. Those are all to be understood in terms of distributive singular terms. The dot snow is white. That's what you're talking about. Those are the expressions. That's the way we should understand that talk. Now this is the view that we're going to read starting next week in his Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, that leads him to this picture of the world in a narrow sense that consists only of what's genuinely nameable. And he's going to give scientific language a privileged role in specifying those namables. Those, in the end, are the things that are nameable in an ultimately defensible natural scientific language. Now here, let me remind you where I think his analysis of alethic modality left us, which was he had a fabulous account of what you're doing when you say that something is a law of nature, or that a regularity holds necessarily. You're endorsing a pattern of subjunctively robust reasoning. That's what you're doing when you make first-hand use of these modal claims. But it's not so clear what you're saying when you say that. What he's got is a story in the pragmatic metavocabulary, but he's drawing conclusions about things that would be stated in a semantic metavocabulary. He's in effect assuming that if something plays this kind of metalinguistic expressive role, it can't also be playing a descriptive representational role. And that might be true, but he doesn't come close to arguing for that, and it's not clear that it's true. I mean, in that case, I suggested how we could understand a derivative, parasitic, descriptive role as being played, derivative and parasitic, because we understand that descriptive role only in terms of the expressive role that it plays. Well, now, here I want to claim we're in an exactly comparable situation. He's got a convincing, I think, account of what you're doing when you use predicative expressions. It's the same thing you'd be doing if you were using the Jumblese translation of what you're saying. He's right that the predicative expressions are dispensable in a way in which the singular terms are not. The only expressions you need are the singular terms and facts about them, which can be facts about how they're related to other expressions, but need not be. They can be other kinds of facts about them. For the monadic ones, of course, their relation to other names is okay, but we can use expressions that are not names to create facts about them, but we don't need to use other expressions. So he's got a story about what you're doing when you use predicative expressions that doesn't require them to pick out some element in the way that names pick out an element. And he's got a metalinguistic story about how, on the basis of what you're doing, just using ordinary names and the nexus of them, facts about them, if there are expressions, is triangular. He's got a metalinguistic story about how you introduce new terms metalinguistically, triangularity, as the dot is triangular, and so how we introduce common nouns like property, under which things like the dot is triangular fall. This is a fabulous metalinguistic story about what you're doing in using all this talk. But he's drawing first semantic conclusions about what you're saying when you do that you are not describing anything in the world in addition to doing the metalinguistic things that his account in the pragmatic metavocabulary says. And further, drawing conclusions about ontology on the basis of that semantics. And in this, he's following Koterbinski, who distinguished two sets of theses that were reistic theses, semantic reism and ontological reism. And basically semantic reism said, there's genuine names and there's these onomatoids. That's the kind of expressions that there are. And the ontological thesis is that what there is what's picked out by, referred to by genuine names. That's what I was talking about last time as a nominalism. Reism, ontologically, based on nominalism, semantically. So I think Sellars jumps from, a fabulous account of the pragmatics of using these things, which has genuine semantic consequences. Names really are semantically fundamental in a way in which predicates are not. And sentential expressions can be thought of just as facts about names. Those are genuinely semantic conclusions. But they don't justify, without arguments that he's not giving us, the semantic conclusion that there's not also a descriptive or fact-stating, empirical fact-stating role, stating facts that are not merely metalinguistic facts. We need an argument that to play the metalinguistic role pragmatically that he's got, that precludes semantically playing a representational or descriptive role. And maybe that's so and maybe that's not. And even if that's right, we still need some more premises to draw the ontological conclusion that we should think of the world as a world of particulars, not as a world of facts. That the sense in which it's a world of particulars precludes facts being in the world. His view is we've got statements and we've got facts, and they're both in the linguistic order. That to talk about a fact is always to talk metalinguistically. And it's to talk metalinguistically in a way that does not have any descriptive role as far as describing anything but the language is concerned. Yeah, Tom.
There's kind of like an indispensability argument in the background, like you can regiment jumbleese to get rid of all predicative vocabulary and stuff like that. But if you get rid of names for particulars, then you can't do anything. There's nothing left you can do. And if you need them, something like that, in order to speak a language at all, then.
Well, I think that's right. I think he's impressed. There's an indispensability argument, as you say, and there's a sufficiency argument.
Right.
He's saying, you can't do without the names, the singular terms, and if you give me those, I can get everything from that, at the cost of saying that the world is not everything that is the case. It's not the collection of facts, not things, which is, after all, where the Tractatus that he's interpreting here comes in, is with that view. So, I mean, the sufficiency is impressive, that he can tell us how to use all these other things just on the basis of the use of names to say something. That's impressive. But does it suffice to decide this question, one of the constellation of issues that we had here, that it's a world of things, not a world of facts? That there's no truth to the conception of the world as consisting of facts. And I would want to argue, probably will argue when we're talking about the scientific image of man, that it actually isn't an intelligible conception in the end. That thinking of the facts as metalinguistic and not as worldly, that this picture of a world just of one damn thing after another, the reistic picture, is not in the end intelligible.
Can I just ask, so, I mean, the way in which you sort of construed the structure was that Sellars is trying to give an argument for nominalism that would, so to speak, commit us to it, but he doesn't actually do that. I mean, there's another way to construe this work, which is what he's trying to do is make it so that we can commit ourselves to nominalism, right? Not to force us to undertake this commitment, but to enable us to. And so, I mean, that's how I tend to read. I mean, I don't think he's entirely clear about exactly what the function of all of this apparatus is. But I tend to read it in that sort of more permissive rather than committive way. I mean, I guess the claim that you will make, presumably next class, is that in fact he doesn't do that because the picture ultimately isn't intelligible. But at this point is...
I think that's a fair way to see it. He can see this just as sort of ground clearing, rather than as giving us sort of reasons to endorse this, other than sort of the beauty of the sufficiency side that we were just talking about. I mean, he ends with some really gnomic passages. This last bit, passage mentioned 27. There is a relation between statements and facts, but both terms are in the linguistic order. But now passage 29. What then does it mean to say that green A is a fact? Clearly this is equivalent to saying that green A is true. That's a Phrygian principle. Facts are just true claimables. Which brings to mind the equivalence that green A is true is just green A. This, however, is not the most perspicuous way to represent matters, for while the equivalence obtains, semantically, indeed necessarily obtains, its truth depends on the principle of inference, inferring, and this is the crux. From that green A is true in our language to infer green A in our language. And it's by virtue of the fact that we draw such inferences that meaning in truth talk gets its connection with the world. In this sense, the connection is done rather than talked about. So now we're talking about the relation between statements and facts. And again, he's regressing to the pragmatics. Let's look at what we're doing. And he's saying you've got to look at the inferences that you make from the claim that something is a fact to, well, endorsing it. Viewed from this perspective, Wittgenstein's later conception of a language as a form of life is already foreshadowed by the ineffability thesis of the Tractatus. But to see this is to see that no ineffability is involved. For while to infer is neither to refer to that which can be referred to, nor to assert that which can be asserted, it's not naming and it's not saying. This does not mean that it is to fail to F something which is therefore ineffable. That's the last sentence of the essay. I say this, I don't really understand what function this claim is performing for him, but it's crucial in understanding what he means when he says, up in 26, that exemplification is no more present in the world of fact in the narrow sense, in which tractarians like Professor Bergman and myself find illuminating, than is meaning or truth, and for the same reason, the reason being that both are metalinguistic. Now, to say that exemplification is metalinguistic is different from saying, to understand the relation between fact and a statement of a fact, you have to think about what you're doing in making an inference of the sort that truth claims license. I mean, that inference is, in a certain sense, metalinguistic, because truth claims are. But still, to say it's metalinguistic is one thing, and to say this all bottoms out in, remember in the other essays, talk about functions, not in the mathematical sense, but in the sense of something that you do. And the claim is these inferrings, they're not in the world in the narrow sense, but they are what connect us to the world. Well, the inferrings are essentially norm-governed doings. They're not, something that we're doing, making the noises, this and then this other noise, that's in the world. But the inferring isn't. The inferring is what connects us to the world in the way that referring and saying do. That is, it's not reducible to the saying and the naming, but it's at the same level they are. Yeah.
Is this at all tangentially like a resolute reading in a way of the Tractatus, or an anti-ineffabilist reading? There's nothing there that.
I think that's right. It's an anti-ineffabilist reading, and there we need to go back to the talk about the nexus.
Right.
But it's a critical reading in that he's disagreeing with, the opening statement that sets everything up, that it's a world of facts, not of things. On this account, Wittgenstein got that wrong. The consequence of his insight in the pi passages is that it's a world of things, not of facts. So anyway, I'm enlightened by seeing the parallel between the argument about the relation of looks talk to is talk, which is looking at a pragmatic dependency as the fundamental thing, but ruling out certain kinds of semantic accounts, thinking of the semantic autonomy of appearances on that basis. His account of modality, again, where he's got a good account in a pragmatic metavocabulary of what we're doing in making firsthand use of these expressions, and his account of abstract object talk, proposition talk, fact talk, again, as metalinguistic as the other is, but of what you're doing when you say these things, a good account. And then the question, well, where we go from there, he wasn't separating out the issues for us. He didn't get them sorted out. But he had, if not a method, a sort of way of proceeding that let him illuminate really puzzling, philosophically puzzling forms of speech. And, we haven't taken that line of thought farther in the 50 years since this came out. And yet he clearly figured some stuff out that's important about these issues, about how to talk about the world of facts and the world of objects, for instance. next time we read the essay that he put first in his collection, Science, Perception, Reality, as sort of giving the comprehensive framework within which the rest of what he was doing was to take place. Well, now we've seen sort of the rest of what was going on, so we should be in a position to read that. And it's much easier to read than the stuff we've been reading before. Okay.